Hello, my name is Bruce Roy and I have been a visiting scholar from India here at Troy University since last summer. During that time, I have worked with members of the English department, including with the senior seminar capstone course, as our graduating seniors have planned the 2024 Hall Waters Prize for the Excellence in Southern Writing. This is an annual award endowed by the late Troy alumnus Dr. Wade Hall to celebrate the literary arts. This year's recipient is Professor Patricia Foster, the author most recently of the memoir Written in the Sky, Lessons of a Southern Daughter. She previously published another memoir, All the Lost Girls, Confessions of a Southern Daughter, and a novel, Girl from the Soldier Creek, as well as numerous essays published in prestigious literary journals. In the program that follows, our honorary, who is a professor emerita of nonfiction at the country's most prestigious writing program at the University of Iowa, sits down with two of our senior seminar members, Carolyn McInnes and Jason Fry, to discuss the art of writing and her prestigious career. Thank you.
Well, Professor Foster, thank you for being with us today and welcome to Troy.
Thank you.
The first question I'm going to be asking is about Written in the Sky, the memoir, and I'm going to talk specifically about your mentions of being a Southern daughter. I wanted to ask about the opinions about your identity of a Southern woman and how it ties to family, religion, community, and prejudice. Where do you stand today with your Southernness?
Well, I think to talk about where I stand today with my Southernness, I have to go back to the past. And one of the things in terms of writing All the Lost Girls is I really did realize that it was only because I failed so definitively as a Southern lady standard that I found a subject and a point of view. So it was the sense of being failed at, and when I say a Southern lady standard, I was supposed to be ambitious, I was supposed to be self-sacrificing, and I was supposed to be nurturing. Well, it's hard to be ambitious and self-sacrificing because that's a kind of contradictory sensibility. And so it was only after I left the South that I claimed the South. It was only after I left the South that I could ever have written All the Lost Girls and come to realize that the things that really did define me in terms of the South were in fact very much family. They were in fact tradition. They were in fact rituals. And I think very much the images, the sort of beauty, the absolutely beautiful images of the South. When retrospectively I think about the South, I think about how difficult it was in terms of gender, because I was raised in the pre-feminist sensibility. It was very difficult in terms of race because I grew up during segregation. It was very difficult in terms of gender and in religion in some ways because my family was not very religious, but there was this sort of insistence on religion in the culture. I think that the South, what I love about the South and what I want to claim about the South is the voice, the sense of the vernacular language and the kind of eloquence that seems intuitive in terms of Southern speech. And that sense of the kind of beauty of that, the sort of lyricism of that language.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting.
Okay.
So I know that you've written mostly creative nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some of the main differences in the challenges between writing nonfiction as opposed to maybe, creating fiction, making up stories?
Right. Well, it's very interesting that you say that because when I wrote Girl from Soldier Creek, everyone assumes it's utterly autobiographical. It's a novel, and the main character is a swimmer. And I remember a friend coming up to me at a conference. She said, "I didn't know you were a swimmer." And I said, "I'm not. It's a novel." And she was so surprised. So obviously, if I had written that as autobiography, I would not have made that character into a swimmer. So part of the sense of, I see there are a lot of similarities between fiction and nonfiction. Obviously, one of the differences is that I try in nonfiction, in autobiography, in essays, in any kind of interpretive reviews even, to stay close to my life, close to not just the events of my life, but to the temperament and to the sensibilities of the self, because I write very much about the personal. In the novel, I'd say I'm very interested in the way a character approaches that identity, which is can be very different than the way an autobiographer approaches identity. For instance, in Girl from Soldier Creek, I write very much from Amanda's point of view. Amanda has a different sensibility. Amanda's like a big character. She's going to go at the world with a roar. I'm not like that. So obviously I'm creating character in a very different way, but in a way that I think speaks to something that I intuitively know or that I've witnessed. I think of autobiography as, in many ways, a testimony, a kind of testimony of self, a kind of testimony of culture, a testimony of identity. And I think of novels as playing with that, but not necessarily in a testimonial way, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So within your family, especially among the older generations, there are some topics in which you and your family disagree. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate those difficult conversations with family members while still managing to honor and respect them?
You're talking about in the flesh, mm-hmm. or in the writing, both and,
both.
Right?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think the thing that's very interesting to me is that as my parents grew older, they became much more sort of revealing about themselves. One thing I thought about in terms of teaching is how few people know very much about their families. A lot of people don't know very much. Mm-hmm. So when I would go visit my mother and we would have conversations, she would tell me conversations about her family and about the difficult parts of her life, which she hadn't told me when I was a younger daughter. So that was, in many ways, very sort of connecting of us. When we had very difficult conversations, which we did have about race and about gender, because my mother thought girls should still be good little girls, it was tense. I mean, I'm not going to pretend it wasn't tense. It was very tense. But sometimes it would be so tense we would laugh and go eat cake or something like that. Other times it would be tense and we would have to leave. We would have to separate and then come back and say to each other, we're different people, we're of different generations. We come to a situation and a circumstance, and particularly a political circumstance, from a different perspective and a different sort of sense of the future. And I'm not saying that it wouldn't necessarily be resolved, but there would be a tempering of that anxiety. And we had both spoken our mind, and we sort of moved on. So sometimes it would be resolved in a certain way, other times it would be just sort of mediated enough to continue our lives. In writing, there's a very different thing that happens. In writing, you think, I am not trying to present myself as having an heroic opinion, or having the right opinion, or having the opinion that matters. So in writing, there's a different sort of cast, the different sort of sense of having to deeply reflect on not only what's being said, but the context and the generation and the emotional impact of what's being said. And so it takes a different kind of, I think, negotiation, an emotional negotiation. Like I loved my mother. I mean, I deeply loved my mother. And I deeply disagreed with my mother about many sort of political sensibilities. And I confess that when I first wrote A Dark Unruly Space, I sent it to the Massachusetts Review. And then I withdrew it because I thought that was revealing too much about my mother and me. But what happened is the editor, this is sort of probably the only time this happened to me, wrote me the most beautiful letter saying, this is a necessary essay. You need to publish this. And I wrote it back and said, I can't, because I feel that it shows my mother in a less than flattering light. But I'll think about it. So you know what I did? I called my mother. And I told her, I said, Mom, remember we had that kind of terrible discussion and we really got mad at each other and it was, not fun at all. And I said, I wrote an essay about it, and I wrote about what you said and wrote about what I said, and I've written this essay, and it's not flattering to either of us. We both have shame, but this editor wants to publish it. What do you think? Because I thought it was unfair for me to just say, sorry, I'm doing this. And she said, okay. And I was like, so totally surprised and very pleased. And then I did publish it.
Yes.
So that was one of the things that happened. With my father, I would say it was very different. My father and I were very opposed when I was in my 20s and 30s, and then we got to be absolutely best friends in my 40s. Do you know how we got to be best friends?
How?
I started writing him letters. I realized that the old-fashioned epistolary form of letters can be very important in a life. So I realized that my father didn't know me. How could he know me? He only knew me from the presence of me as a daughter at home. So I thought, what if my father knew about my interior life? What if he knew the things I'd struggled with, the very things that he probably thought he'd protected me from, right? And so I just sort of took that risk and I wrote him. And I really wrote him about the ways that I'd been broken. It wasn't a sweet letter, not by him, but by how different parts of my life had broken me. And what I tried to do to heal myself. I had no idea what the response would be. But my father, like I said, when he got the letter, he called me, he said, come home. And then he started writing me letters, believe it or not, on prescription pads. Because he was a doctor. And so every now and then, I get these little letters on prescription pads and just tell me a little message or something. And then he became my biggest fan. I mean, somebody who had not approved really of writing and art because you couldn't make any money, he was like, fine, you do it and you just keep doing it.
That's
so wonderful. It was great. It was like, it was actually redemptive. Yeah. Because part of the thing that I learned, I had thought that I, as a daughter, had been a failure. Not in the sense of just failing in life, but my parents, because they came from a very Faulknerian background, they were very poor, they had worked really hard to be part of the middle class, and I was supposed to maintain that. And I was supposed to write what I call a chronology of redemption. I was supposed to redeem every hard work they'd done. I was to maintain that. And that was to be my redemption of everything they had given me, because I grew up privileged. And when I felt like I failed at that, that's when I felt deep sorrow. But because I wrote it out, and then my father began to approve of me and approve of the writing, it sort of bolstered me. Gave me like a little more grit.
That's great.
So I'm great for that.
That's beautiful.
So I wanted to ask a question specifically about Written in the Sky.
Okay.
How do you put together a collection like Written in the Sky? So do you kind of write a collection of pieces and then put them all together? Or do you write pieces, with the intention to put together a collection like Written in the Sky? And if so, if you do the latter, how do you know when, this book is finished?
That's a wonderful question, and a difficult question. The other books I'd written had been intentional incarnations of work. In other words, I knew I was writing All the Lost Girls. I knew it had a certain chronology. I knew that it was going to be a continuous narrative coming of age. When I started writing Written in the Sky, I actually only started writing it after I'd gone to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. I'd gone 3 times, and I wrote the first essay. I actually can't remember during what period. It was before the 3rd time I went. And after I wrote that essay, it somehow was sort of a catalyst in a way for me to start thinking more deeply about my life in the South in terms of the racial complications of that life. I live in Iowa. Iowa's, like I said, clinically white, but it seemed to me that my concerns were with the South, and the South was so poignant and so political. What I did was I started collecting essays. So it was really the latter, your idea of the latter sense. There were some essays that I had already written, and I started adding to those. But I started thinking that these were sort of lessons that would be for posterity. There would be family lessons. There were the things that were sort of the emergence of class and gender, because class was the first part of the section. So the first is lessons of the family, their family lessons. Then I realized that I wanted to look at lessons of history. Like, what did I learn in terms of history? What did I not learn? And most particularly, what did I not learn? And what did I not learn through my own lack of observation, through my own lack of participation, through my own lack of perception? So I was looking at the lessons of history as ways in which I could communicate the ideas of the past, but also through my shame, through my curiosity, through my indignation, and through just pure interest. So I wrote many of those after I decided to make this collection, which would be inclusive of older essays and newer essays. So I wrote a lot of those essays in lessons from history lessons during a certain period. I was simultaneously losing my family. And to lose your family and to lose the people who have been most important to you, you do not know the ways you will grieve. One of the ways that I grieved was to write about them. So the same simultaneously as I was writing history lessons, I was also writing, literally for my own comfort in a way, these essays of loss. One was the loss of an important professor, the first black man to win a Pulitzer Prize. He'd been an incredible professor to me, although we probably met only 5 times. I mean, that seems insane, right? But it's that kind of impression, that kind of importance that somebody can have that changes you. He would say, read this, read this, read this, and I'd be like, that works, and that works, and that works. I need all those 3 things. And he was from Savannah. He was from the South, and we used to sit at his kitchen table in Iowa. He'd say, I won't go back to the South until you do. And so we had this bond because we were afraid of the South at that point. So I wrote about him because I wanted to I wanted to validate both his humanity and his importance to me as a person. Simultaneous to that, my sister was dying, my mother was dying, my father had already died, and so I was writing this sense of loss, the sense of the legacy that I'd been given. So the legacy at the end was essentially juxtaposed with the legacy of the beginning of their lives, and in between was history. And so I tried to bookend it then with the trip to the memorial for peace and justice.
It's amazing.
It was actually, but to put it together was very interesting because I didn't know. I was just writing essays for a while, just writing pieces.
That is so interesting. This kind of leads right into this next question. Your memoir Written in the Sky ends with a section called Archive of the Dead that lists several victims of lynching you read about while visiting the lynching memorial in Montgomery. Can you explain in terms of form the function of transcribing the information on those plaques? Also, you say that each plaque is an ambush. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. It's very interesting to me to go to the memorial because it wasn't that you had a single feeling or a single emotional response. Because it was nuanced, that response, there would be times I'd be going through the memorial that I would be overwhelmed. And there'd be times when I was going through the memorial that I would be tired. I mean, literally, physically, emotionally tired. When I came out at the end, when I sat down to this, in the middle, they have a fountain. It's a beautiful fountain for memories of those who were lynched were unnamed and unknown, but nevertheless mourned. So when I came to write the Archive of the Dead, part of the experience of going by that wall that had those names, dates, and places and reasons, it was so fundamental, I think, because all it's given me is a name, date, and a place and a reason, that I found that some of the most moving part of the entire memorial. And so when I came out and decided to write that, I didn't know how to write that. I mean, I didn't know how to write any of it. So the only thing that I can imagine is thinking of them as archives, the things that will always be, that you'll always remember, that'll be stated somewhere, that'll be carefully put away somewhere. So it was kind of like my my own mourning and my own sort of validation of that reality. But what it did to me, and the reason it was sort of an ambush for me personally, was because it brought up Maddie. It brought up the May that I'd had. My mother was a teacher, my father was a doctor in this little tiny town in northern Alabama. And Maddie took care of me. So Maddie was a given to me. As a child, you don't make assumptions, you know, you're not, it's not that you're not curious, but you sort of assume that the way things are is the way things are. So it was an ambush to me because it made me think about Maddie and the fact that I knew nothing about Maddie and had asked nothing about Maddie, and it made me curious about what had her life been in this very Jim Crow South, taking care of a little white girl, swinging her. But what was her life? And so it brought up that sense of questioning and not just curiosity, but sadness, I think, that I didn't know. Mm.
So I wanted to ask, you know, in your memoir, you make a distinction between Fairhope and Foley, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask if you could explain why that distinction is there, despite their proximity geographically.
Oh, great. They're very different places, and I like them both for very different reasons. Foley, when I grew up, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s in this small town, was a potato farming town. So it was a farm town, 10 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. Quite beautiful beaches. We didn't know them very much about them. We went there to go swimming and come back with our wet bathing suits. So it was very much a farm town, and I'd say provincial in many ways. Everybody knew each other. You knew everybody's business, like you do in small towns. Fairhope began as a socialist community, which was very interesting. It was like going into a different world. So it began in the Gilded Age. A man from Iowa, a journalist from Iowa, of all places. So I'm always being drawn back to the relationship between Iowa and Alabama. So a man from Iowa started with other people this community. Land was not owned, it was communally owned. It was in a beautiful place. It's right by Mobile Bay. They had an organic school there, which was not a private school, but a school where students, if they wanted to jump out the window, they jumped out the window. They grew gardens. They were not given grades. So it's a very different place to be. It was not conventional at all. So we took music from Mama Dot. That's what everyone called her, Mama Dot. So we went to Fairhope. We entered this other world. And it was a world that for me was incredibly nurturing because it said, you can be anything. You don't have to be the more conventional kid from the small potato farm. You can be anything. So that's the way they resonated for me. One was freedom. One was the potential, the possibility to invent oneself. And one was about art. It's about music and dancing. And Foley was about going to school.
That's so sweet. That's awesome. Very quickly, can you tell us a little about your next chapter, both literally and figuratively? How do you want to approach a next literary work?
Well, I've just finished a book, so that's always good, right?
Yes, yes.
But I haven't sent it out yet. So I just finished a book that had been working on for quite a while. Actually, was put aside while I was writing Written in the Sky. That was very much looking at, it's called The New World, and it's about marriage, illness, and a hidden past. So it's looking very much at the way, I had never written about marriage. I've mainly written about childhood and my family, really, but I'd never written about marriage. I'd never written about illness. And so my husband had a very rare cancer, one that had not been seen by the University of Iowa doctors, which was not fun. And so we didn't know sort of what the results would be because it was so rare. So what happened was that after my husband recovered, he actually became more interested in his past. So part of that story is looking at his past and looking at what had been a very traumatic past in foster care. So it's a return to memoir. Simultaneously, I've been writing stories. I've been trying to write this story cycle that begins in the Civil War and goes all the way up to the 1980s. That's insane, right? But I got very interested in what would happen to women in the Civil
Right.
War. So it's about women in the Civil War. But these are literally fictional stories that move from the Civil War in Winston County, Alabama, which was, you may have heard, the Free State of Winston. It was the county that tried to secede from Alabama when Alabama seceded from the Union. You know about that? And so it starts in Winston County because my mother's father lived in Winston County. So my grandfather, so I had these sort of ties to Winston County. Everything for me has some autobiographical tie. So it looks at the progression of a family from civil, pre-Civil War to 1980, with a lot of gaps in between, obviously. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I believe that we're kind of getting close to out of time, but I wanted to say thank you again, Ms. Foster, for coming to see us at Troy, and we're looking forward to whatever you write next. We've loved having you here.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to be here. You guys are brilliant.